On the first truly warm afternoon of May, the village of Milchester had turned out in its best frocks and jackets to admire roses that were not yet in bloom. It was called, with that stubborn English optimism about the weather and the seasons, the Spring Rose Fête, and was being held in the gardens of the Elms, a large, rather gloomy house on the edge of the village, now temporarily brightened by bunting, trestle tables, and the bustle of good works. Miss Jane Marple, seated a little apart under a yew tree, knitted steadily and watched the crowd with mild blue eyes that missed surprisingly little. She had come ostensibly because the fête was in aid of the church roof fund, but in reality because nothing interested her more than a number of people gathered together under the illusion that they were merely enjoying themselves. Long experience had taught her that human nature showed itself most clearly over teacups and raffle tickets. The Elms, lately rechristened by the villagers as the House of the Five Widows, provided material enough for any observer. Its owner, Mrs. Agatha Carstone, a handsome woman in her late 60s with an air of formidable benevolence, had been widowed some 15 years. After her husband's death, she had filled the rambling house with 4 other widows of varying degrees of gentility and misfortune. There was pale, fluttering Mrs. Lydia Marsh, whose late husband had been in shipping, dark, self-contained Mrs. Irene Blake, whose colonel had died in India, placid Mrs. Joan Pritchard, whose solicitor spouse had succumbed to what was always vaguely referred to as overwork, and brisk little Mrs. Ellen Ward, whose builder husband's fatal fall from scaffolding was still discussed with some relish by Milchester tongues. "They do say," murmured Mrs. Dolly Bantry to Miss Marple, leaning over with the air of imparting spiritual sustenance along with a plate of sponge cake, "that there's not so much money as there looks, and that Mrs. Carstone keeps a very sharp eye on the others' pensions." She paused, clearly hoping to be encouraged. Miss Marple merely observed that shared households were often difficult. "One learns a great deal," she added, "about character where there is only one bathroom." At 3 o'clock precisely, the vicar said a few words. The ladies' committee fluttered importantly, and the judging of the Victoria Sponge competition commenced. At 3:30, the first raffle was drawn. At 3:45, someone remarked that Mrs. Irene Blake, who was to open the second-hand bookstore, was nowhere to be seen. This was considered at first merely tiresome. By 4 o'clock, tiresome had shaded almost imperceptibly into disquieting. Mrs. Carstone, her color higher than usual, sent first a maid, then Mrs. Ward, to look for Irene. Teacups rattled a little more sharply in their saucers. Voices dropped as people speculated. It was Miss Marple who noticed the way Lydia Marsh's hand shook so much that she spilled her tea, and the rapid bird-like glance Mrs. Carstone shot towards the house. At 4:10, everyone heard the scream from inside the Elms. It was high, thin, and horribly prolonged, slicing across the cheerful chatter like a knife through the cream of a trifle, and leaving behind it a shocked, ringing silence. Nobody moved at first. The soft ticking of the mantel clock seemed suddenly loud, an impertinent reminder that time, at least, went on as usual. Then Mrs. Hartwell drew herself up with a visible effort and set down her cup with a crack of china on saucer. "Don't stand there gaping, Polly," she said sharply. "Show us." "Oh, Beatrice, really?" murmured Mrs. Marsh, but she was already rising, one gloved hand fluttering at her throat. Miss Marple stood with the others, though she took a moment to roll her ball of wool neatly and slip it into her work bag. The smallest habits, she had often reflected, were best maintained in moments of shock. They helped one to think clearly. They passed through the French doors into the garden, the air outside strangely cool after the scented warmth of the drawing-room. The lawn at Rosemere was broad and well kept, sloping gently down toward a yew hedge beyond which the red-tiled roof of the summer-house could be seen. The widows moved together in a little knot, their black and grey forms oddly funereal against the bright tulips. "Stay here, all of you," Mrs. Hartwell commanded as they approached the hedge. "I will see first. There is no need for everyone to swoon." "Indeed, Beatrice," Mrs. Blackwood said dryly. "I have never swooned in my life and do not propose to begin now." Miss Marple, unaddressed, merely kept pace, her sharp blue eyes noting the trampled edge of a flower bed. A small broken twig, the way Polly's apron was smeared with something darker than garden soil. The girl kept glancing over her shoulder with the furtive fascination of the frightened. The summer house stood in a little paved circle, its wooden door thrown wide. From where they paused, Miss Marple could see a pair of brown shoes just inside the threshold, one heel twisted outward at an unnatural angle. The air carried a faint metallic tang that was not, she thought, entirely unfamiliar. Mrs. Hartwell gave a small, genuine gasp. "It's him," she said. "That man, the one who has been pestering us. Mr. Briggs, he called himself." His real name, Miss Marple reflected, might very well be something else altogether. They drew closer. The man lay half on his side, one arm flung out, fingers crooked as if reaching for the door. His hat had rolled into a corner. His thinning hair was matted darkly at the back of his head. There was a pool of blood on the flagstones, already beginning to thicken, creeping into the cracks between the stones in sluggish rivulets. "How dreadful," whispered Mrs. Marsh. "Oh, how very dreadful." Mrs. Ward said nothing at all. Her face had gone so white that her freckles stood out like stains. Her eyes, though, were fixed not on the dead man, but on something just beyond him, a folded scrap of paper lying near the wall. Miss Marple noticed the way her gaze darted to it and away again, like a hand that longed to snatch and dared not. "You must send for the police at once, Beatrice," said Mrs. Blackwood. Her voice was calm, but a tiny nerve trembled at the corner of her mouth. "And for a doctor, of course, though I fancy he is past all help." "Polly," Mrs. Hartwell said, "run to the telephone. Ask for Dr. Haydock in the police station. Tell them there has been an accident." Miss Marple's head turned a fraction. Accident was not, she thought, the word that most people would have chosen, but then Mrs. Hartwell had always prided herself on knowing the proper thing to say, even when it was not precisely accurate. As Polly fled, skirts flying, Miss Marple stepped delicately nearer, careful to keep to the dry portions of the flagstones. Her gaze, apparently vague, moved from the man's shoes, mud on the left sole only, to his right hand, smeared with blood and something else, a faint brownish stain at the fingertips. Tobacco, perhaps, or dust. On his crumpled waistcoat glinted a cheap metal tie pin in the shape of a small, rather ill-made horseshoe. A lucky charm, some would have called it. Miss Marple, who knew a good deal about luck, thought it interesting that he had not been luckier that afternoon. Behind her, Mrs. Pritchard began to cry quietly, the sound thin and oddly rhythmic. It struck Miss Marple as the weeping of someone not at all surprised, but profoundly inconvenienced. Yes, she thought, there is something here that did not begin with this poor man's death. Something that started some time ago and has only now come to its inevitable conclusion. Aloud, she said only, "How very sad, and how very awkward for you, Mrs. Hartwell." "Awkward?" repeated Mrs. Hartwell, offended. "For the police," Miss Marple amended gently. "They do so dislike a stranger turning up dead in a respectable village. It makes everything so much more complicated." Inspector Craddock stood just inside the summer house, broad shoulders framed against the doorway, his hat pushed back a little as he surveyed the body with a practiced, unsentimental eye. He had the air of a man who respected facts and disliked embellishments. Yet even he seemed aware that Rosemere House, its climbing roses, its wide lawns, its scattering of widows, presented something more complicated than an ordinary village tragedy. "We'll have to take statements from everyone present," he said at last, his tone brisk but not unkind. "No one is to leave the property until we finish the preliminary inquiries." Mrs. Hartwell drew herself up, offended dignity quivering. "Inspector, I assure you that no one here could possibly—" "Possibly or not, madam," Craddock interrupted, with the faintest suggestion of apology. "A man has been killed on your grounds with a tool from your shed. You'll understand we can't rely on assurances." Miss Marple, who had unobtrusively seated herself on a white-painted bench, regarded him with a mild, approving gaze. She remembered Craddock from another matter some years back, and he, catching sight of her, gave the smallest of nods, half greeting, half wary acknowledgement. He had learned by now that the quiet old lady with the knitting had a remarkable habit of being right. They gathered in the drawing room once more, the atmosphere changed utterly from that of an hour before. The teacups still stood where they had been abandoned, some with rims of pale lipstick, others with undissolved sugar at the bottom. Small domestic ghosts of a world before death entered by the garden path. "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, "the maids might clear the tea, dear Beatrice? One thinks better without so many fragments underfoot." Mrs. Hartwell, who had been on the verge of a dignified breakdown, seized gratefully on the practical suggestion and rang for Polly, who appeared with red-rimmed eyes and shaky hands. The girl jumped at every clink of porcelain, but Miss Marple noticed that her fright did not prevent her casting curious glances at Mrs. Ward and Mrs. Blackwood in turn. Inspector Craddock began his questions methodically. Each widow gave her account of the afternoon. Who had poured tea for whom? Who had remarked on the stranger in the village? Who had first heard Polly's scream? The answers on the surface were simple and consistent, yet it seemed to Miss Marple that they were just a little too neatly aligned, as though each woman had seen, at some earlier moment, the same danger and silently agreed upon the safest version of events. "And before this afternoon," Craddock asked, "had any of you spoken to the deceased, Mr. Arthur Gentry?" Mrs. Marsh fluttered. "Certainly not, Inspector. A man asking questions about the war, about officers, about units, we thought him quite impertinent." "He spoke to me once in the High Street," said Mrs. Pritchard slowly. "Asked if I had known a Captain Morrison. I told him I had not." "Did you?" murmured Miss Marple, so softly that it could have been to herself, for she had seen the slight color rise in Mrs. Pritchard's cheeks, the way her hands had twisted together as she lied with remarkable composure. Craddock glanced at Miss Marple, then back at the widows. "This Captain Morrison seems to be at the heart of Mr. Gentry's inquiries. Any of you know the name? Think carefully." The silence that followed was longer this time, heavier. Outside, the first drops of rain began to tap against the window panes, an insistent, accusing sound. Mrs. Blackwood's lips parted, then closed again. Young Miss Ward looked down at her hands, clenched tight in her lap. "Names from the war blur together," Miss Marple observed gently. "So many young men, all over Europe. And yet sometimes, one name stays very sharp indeed in the memory." Her eyes, apparently vague, passed over each woman in turn. One of them, she felt sure, had known Captain Morrison very well indeed. Word of the murder traveled through St. Mary Mead with that peculiar swiftness reserved for scandal, misfortune, and unexpectedly early frosts. By the next morning, the Blue Boar was doing brisk business in coffee and conjecture. At the small table by the window, Mr. and Mrs. Larkin were deep in discussion, their bacon cooling on untouched plates. "Mark my words," Mr. Larkin declared, tapping his egg spoon against the saucer. "Those ladies up at Rosemere House know more than they're saying. 5 widows under one roof. It's not natural, Em. Not natural at all." Mrs. Larkin sniffed. "It's economy, George, that's what it is. You'd know about that if you'd seen the price of sugar lately." "Still," she lowered her voice, "I always said there was something odd about that young Mrs. Ward. Too much money too soon, if you ask me. And that husband of hers, falling off the scaffolding like that." Now, came a mild voice from the adjoining table. "People do have accidents, Mrs. Larkin. Though, of course, sometimes an accident is not quite so accidental as it appears, human nature being what it is." Miss Marple, who had come in ostensibly for a modest breakfast and a fresh supply of village talk, stirred her tea delicately. Her blue eyes were as mild and vague as ever, but she had already learned from Mr. Baker, the innkeeper, that Mr. Gentry had arrived 3 days earlier, paid in cash, and asked a surprising number of questions about Rosemere House and its occupants. Asked after the war, too, Mr. Baker had confided. Wanted to know who'd served, who hadn't, who'd lost what. Took particular note when I mentioned Colonel Blackwood, ma'am, and how his widow come to be at Rosemere. Miss Marple had filed this away with other small observations. That Mrs. Hartwell had been unusually solicitous of Mrs. Marsh as they left the summer house. That Mrs. Pritchard had kept her handbag clutched to her even in the shock of discovery, and that young Mrs. Ward had been the only one to glance down, just once, at the place where that small scrap of white paper had been. After breakfast, she walked slowly back toward the high street, her sensible shoes making little sound on the damp pavement. It was no surprise to find Inspector Craddock striding toward her, his expression both harassed and relieved. "Miss Marple, I was hoping I might run into you." "Such things do happen, Inspector," she said pleasantly. "I always think villagers have a way of arranging encounters just when they're most needed. How is poor Mrs. Hartwell bearing up?" "Imperious as ever," Craddock replied dryly. "She insists this is all a terrible mistake, that none of them knew Captain Morrison, and that Mr. Gentry must have been unbalanced. Yet he had their names and histories in his notebook. All 5 widows, all widowed during or just after the war. Coincidences do occur," Miss Marple observed. "Though when they begin to pile up, one does start to feel one is tidying a room, only to find dust returning in the same peculiar corner." Craddock smiled despite himself. Gentry's last entry reads, "Appointment, 4 o'clock, Summer House, R.H. Promised full story at last." No initials beyond that. R.H. could be Rosemere House or Mrs. Hartwell, Miss Marple finished gently. "Though people in love or fear often use initials differently, I have noticed. They can stand for a place, a person, even a memory they dare not name." Craddock hesitated. "I don't suppose you noticed anything yesterday? Small, perhaps, but out of place?" Miss Marple considered, her expression vague. "Only that someone was very quick to remove a piece of paper Mr. Gentry had dropped. People are so terribly afraid of written things, Inspector. They seem so much more incriminating than spoken words, which blow away like leaves." His eyes sharpened. "And which of the ladies removed it?" "Oh," Miss Marple said mildly. "I think it will be far more illuminating if we allow them all the opportunity to forget it existed." The storm had passed by the time Miss Marple made her slow way back to her cottage, though the air retained that peculiar charged freshness that follows a heavy rain. Inspector Craddock had taken Mrs. Pritchard into what he termed informal custody for further questioning, and Rosemere House had dissolved into a flurry of hysterics and whispered conferences behind half-closed doors. The next morning, the village reacted with its customary efficiency. By 9 o'clock, everyone from Mr. Tilling at the grocer's to Mrs. Price Ridley at the post office knew that a London detective had been murdered at Rosemere House, that he had been investigating some vague war business, and that poor Mrs. Pritchard had been practically dragged away in handcuffs. The degree to which these details matched the truth was, as usual, open to interpretation. Miss Marple arrived at the post office just as Mrs. Price Ridley was telling Miss Hart how these quiet widows are always the worst sort. Years of pent-up emotion, you know, and suddenly something snaps. "I've always said," Mrs. Price Ridley declared, stamping a parcel with unnecessary vigor, "that house was unnatural. 5 widows under one roof. It invites tragedy. If it wasn't murder, it would be spiritualism or vegetarianism or something equally disturbing." "Human nature, dear Mrs. Price Ridley," Miss Marple observed mildly, selecting a sheet of stamps. "People are very much the same everywhere, whether in a large house or a cottage. Only the opportunities differ." "Well, I don't see what else there is to say," Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed. "The police have arrested Mrs. Pritchard, haven't they? Mud on her shoes, a tear in her sleeve, and no proper alibi. It all fits very neatly." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, her pale eyes thoughtful. "Perhaps a little too neatly, don't you think? In my experience, life very seldom arranges itself into such tidy patterns. When it appears to do so, there is usually a pair of careful hands, human hands involved." She left the post office with her purchases and a mind full of quiet certainties. By 11 o'clock, she was seated in the vicarage study opposite Inspector Craddock, who was chewing on the end of his pencil with the air of a man trying to make evidence behave itself. "I know what you're going to say, Miss Marple," he began wearily. "It's all too obvious, but we have motive. Her late husband's estate went badly, bills piling up, and Gentry's notes show he'd made inquiries about a discrepancy in Captain Morrison's effects that somehow led him to Mrs. Pritchard. Motive, yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Means and opportunity also appear to be present. But I find myself rather more interested in those who benefit from Mrs. Pritchard's arrest than in poor Mrs. Pritchard herself." Craddock looked up sharply. "You think someone is framing her?" "I think," Miss Marple said, selecting her words with care, "that someone in that house knew Mr. Isautier." Gentry had come dangerously close to a truth related to Captain Morrison's death, and that someone had the intelligence to understand how very useful Mrs. Pritchard's little weaknesses might be as a diversion. Craddock frowned. "But the note to Polly, you're suggesting that was forged?" "Surely," Miss Marple murmured. "You noticed the way Mrs. Hartwell held her pen when signing your statement? A most distinctive angular hand. It would make an excellent model for a clever imitator. And there is the matter of the missing paper from the summer house." "So you did see something there?" Craddock said eagerly. "I thought you were watching the ground." "I was watching everything," Miss Marple replied gently. "As one must, when people are trying so very hard to distract. I think, Inspector, that before we are done, we shall find that this murder began not yesterday afternoon, but on a very different day indeed, somewhere in France in 1944. For several moments no one spoke, as if the tarnished little case on the handkerchief were some relic from a grave that ought never to have been disturbed. At last, Mrs. Pritchard gave a choked sound, half sob, half protest, and shrank back into her chair. "I have never seen that thing before in my life," she whispered. "I swear it. Why would I keep such a souvenir if I had done anything wrong?" Inspector Craddock regarded her with a patience that was almost kind, but his tone remained official. "It is sometimes surprising, Mrs. Pritchard, what people choose to keep. Guilt and sentiment can look very much alike from the outside." Miss Marple, who had resumed her knitting with an absent air, spoke without looking up. "And yet, dear Inspector, people do not usually bury treasured objects in rose beds. They are rather more likely to tuck them away in drawers or under false bottoms in work boxes. Burials," she added mildly, "suggest haste or the intention that something be found later by the right person." His eyes flicked toward her, the faintest twitch of a smile betraying that he took the point. "It was well concealed," he said. "Deep enough that Polly wouldn't have turned it up weeding. Somebody knew where to look. Then someone had watched it being buried," Miss Marple said quietly. "Or had been told." Mrs. Marsh, who had been silent for some minutes, suddenly burst into noisy tears. "I cannot bear it," she cried. "All this talk of graves and burials and the war. It was all so long ago, and we have suffered enough. Why can't they leave it alone?" Her outburst might have seemed merely hysterical, but Miss Marple noticed the fleeting warning glance Mrs. Blackwood sent her, too controlled to be mere concern, more like a signal. "And yet," Miss Marple said gently, "it does have rather a way of not leaving us, doesn't it? The past, I mean. One thinks it is neatly packed away like out-of-season clothing, and then a button turns up in quite the wrong drawer." Inspector Craddock cleared his throat. "I shall have to ask each of you formally about any acquaintance with Captain Morrison, but for tonight no one is to leave Rosemere House. Constable Briggs will remain in the hall." The widows dispersed slowly, like actors leaving a stage after an unsettling performance. Mrs. Hartwell departed with offended dignity, Mrs. Marsh leaning on her arm, still sobbing. Mrs. Pritchard moved as if in a daze, while Mrs. Ward lingered a moment by the doorway, biting her lip. It was then that Miss Marple noticed the small, crumpled object partially hidden beneath a side table, overlooked in the earlier commotion. She stooped with a little murmur about her troublesome knees. and retrieved it. It was a scrap of cheap notepaper, torn roughly at the edges, bearing 3 hastily written words in a firm masculine hand. Summer House, half 3. Miss Marple's eyes softened with something like pity. She folded the scrap very small and slipped it into her work bag, her face the picture of vague, elderly preoccupation. Only Mrs. Ward, turning back at the last moment, saw the movement. Their eyes met briefly, and the young widow looked suddenly, desperately afraid. Later, as the rain eased and dusk settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat in the guest bedroom allotted to her, her knitting lying idle in her lap. 5 widows under one roof, bound by shared loss and, perhaps, by something darker than bereavement. A dead investigator, a buried cigarette case, a forged note, and a rendezvous that had ended in death. "People are so like the flowers in a mixed border," she murmured to herself. "They crowd one another dreadfully, and one never quite sees the roots." It occurred to her that before the night was over, someone in Rosemere House might be desperate enough to rearrange that crowded border, and perhaps to pull up one plant entirely, before it had the chance to bloom into full confession. The gathering broke up only when Inspector Craddock, with a glance at the clock and the drawn faces before him, declared that formal statements would be taken in the morning. Until then, no one was to leave Rosemere House without his permission. Mrs. Hartwell protested at this indignity, but even she seemed relieved when the women dispersed to their respective rooms, as if the very walls might be listening. Miss Marple, pleading her age and a slight chill from the garden, was shown to a small guest bedroom overlooking the drive. From there, she could see the curve of the gravel, the faint glimmer of the village road beyond, and just visible between the trees, the dim outline of the summer house like a pale smudge in the growing darkness. She did not undress immediately. Instead, she sat by the window with her knitting, her mind turning over the afternoon's events with the methodical precision of someone arranging pattern pieces. Murder, in her long experience, was rarely as complicated as it first appeared. Human motives tended to be rather simple: fear, greed, love, and that curious desire for revenge that could ferment for years before bubbling to the surface. The house settled gradually into uneasy quiet. Floors creaked overhead. Doors closed with too careful softness, and once or twice Miss Marple heard the low murmur of distant voices, quickly hushed. Somewhere a clock chimed 10, then 11. It was shortly after 11 that she heard it, the faint crunch of gravel from the drive below, where no one had any proper business at that hour. She moved to the window, careful to stay behind the curtain. A single figure was crossing the drive, coat thrown over a nightdress, head bare in the cool night air. Mrs. Ward. The young widow moved with nervous haste toward the path that led not to the summer house, but to the side of the house where a small, separate door gave access to the scullery, and beyond it, the tool shed. Miss Marple watched as Sylvia Ward paused, glanced back toward the house with the instinctive guilt of someone doing what she ought not, then disappeared into the shadows. A light flared briefly in the scullery window, then vanished. 2 minutes later, another sound reached Miss Marple's sharp ears. Footsteps again, heavier this time, purposeful. A second figure moved across the drive, this one more cautious, keeping close to the shrubbery. Taller, broader shouldered. From the way the figure paused to consult something, a watch, perhaps, Miss Marple had no difficulty recognizing Inspector Craddock. He too disappeared toward the rear of the house. It was, Miss Marple reflected, rather like watching actors take their places for the second act of a play. She waited, counting silently. 1 minute, 2, 5. The shout, when it came, fractured the night. Miss Marple was already on her feet when hurried footsteps pounded along the passage, and Polly's frightened knock rattled her door. "Miss Marple! Miss Marple, wake up! There's been—" "Oh, please, ma'am, you must come quickly. It's Mrs. Ward. Something's happened in the tool shed." The scene behind the house was lit by a single harsh lantern. Sylvia Ward sat slumped on an upturned crate just inside the open shed, her face gray, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Beside her, on the packed earth floor, lay a small, overturned tinnis box and the scattered contents of what had clearly been a carefully hidden hoard, old letters tied with perished, ribbon, a ration book, a faded photograph of a young officer in uniform, and, most damningly, a folded sheet of official-looking paper bearing the War Office crest. Inspector Craddock stood over the scene, expression taut. "Found her trying to burn these," he said grimly, indicating the blackened matches near Sylvia's feet. "If Polly hadn't screamed at the sight of me in the doorway, I fancy they'd be ash by now." "I wasn't trying to destroy evidence," Sylvia cried wildly. "You don't understand. I was trying to destroy him. Captain Morrison. He's ruined enough lives already." Miss Marple's eyes had gone at once to the photograph. The young officer's features, though blurred by time, were unmistakably those of the cigarette case's owner. But it was not the likeness that interested her most. It was the expression in Sylvia Ward's eyes as she stared at the face. Not love, not grief. Something far more complicated. Hate, Miss Marple thought gently, and perhaps, just perhaps, fear. Whatever truth lay buried with Captain Morrison's memory, it seemed clear that Arthur Gentry's murder was only the most recent consequence of a betrayal that had begun long before any of them had set foot in Rosemere House. For a moment, no one spoke. The forged papers lay on the low table between them like some tawdry stage prop exposed beneath harsh lights. The grand tale of espionage and treason, so carefully invoked to frighten and confuse, suddenly looked thin and shabby. What remained, Miss Marple reflected, was something far more familiar. Money, fear, and the complicated resentments that grew wherever people lived too closely for too long. Inspector Craddock, recovering first, gathered the papers with professional care. "So Mr. Gentry was being led down the garden path," he said slowly. "Somebody wanted him to believe there was a wartime traitor here, to keep him occupied, and then to provide a noble-sounding motive for his death. A patriotic killing, one might say." "Very comforting patriotism," Miss Marple said mildly. "It disguises so many little unpleasantnesses. One doesn't like to think that someone killed merely for money or self-preservation when one can cloak the matter in loyalty to king and country." Mrs. Hartwell bristled. "Are you suggesting, Miss Marple, that this elaborate business about Captain Morrison was nothing but a smokescreen? That we are being slandered, every one of us, for some petty, modern purpose?" "I shouldn't call it petty," Miss Marple replied, her eyes resting thoughtfully on young Mrs. Ward. "Murder is rarely petty, dear Mrs. Hartwell, though the cause may be disappointingly ordinary." Mrs. Ward flinched as though struck. Her hands, Miss Marple noticed, were tightly clenched in her lap, the knuckles showing white. "Mr. Gentry wasn't a fool," the younger woman said in a low voice. "He told me yesterday he had begun to doubt the whole treason theory. He said the money trail from Captain Morrison's estate didn't make sense if his death had been political. That caught Craddock's attention at once." "Money trail? There was a private account?" Mrs. Ward went on, staring fixedly at the rain-blurred garden. "Funds transferred out of the Morrison estate in small sums over several years after the war. Always to intermediaries. Mr. Gentry had traced one such payment to a building society account here in the county. He believed it was connected to someone at Rosemere House." Mrs. Marsh gave a strangled little cry, quite genuine this time. "You never said," she broke off, biting her lip, then looked miserably at Mrs. Hartwell. "Beatrice, we agreed. No more talk of money. We were to live quietly, gratefully, and let the past rest." Miss Marple's eyes grew very gentle. "It is never the past that refuses to rest," she said softly. "It is the living who keep poking at it. Bills to be paid, needs to be met, advantages to be secured. One sees it constantly in villages." Craddock turned, sharp now. "Mrs. Marsh, are you receiving money from the Morrison estate?" "No," she stammered, then sagged. "Not directly. Beatrice has helped me these last years. When Harold died, there was almost nothing left. She said it was her Christian duty." The last phrase came out with a faint bitterness. Miss Marple had noted long ago that Mrs. T. Marsh owned 2 very good quality winter coats for a woman always claiming poverty, an inconsistency that had seemed slight at the time, like a dropped stitch easily picked up later. "And where does Rosemere's Christian charity come from?" Craddock asked quietly. Mrs. Hartwell drew herself up, color rising in her face. "My late husband's investments. I have told you so." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "although I have also heard you complain to Mr. Clement on more than one occasion about the wretched performance of those same investments. Only last month you told him you were being bled white by this house and its occupants." It was a small thing, an old lady's memory of a conversation in the church porch, but it landed now with unexpected weight. Mrs. Hartwell's lips thinned. "Are you implying, Miss Marple," she said icily, "that I have killed to protect my bank balance?" "Oh no, dear," Miss Marple answered, with such mildness that several women actually relaxed. "I am implying that someone here has killed to protect a quite different source of income, a source Mr. Gentry was on the verge of uncovering. And that, I fancy, is rather more alarming than any nonsense about wartime treason." At that moment, the telephone rang in the hall, shrill and insistent. Polly darted out to answer it, her footsteps echoing. When she returned, her face was chalk white. "It's the Blue Boar, sir," she told Inspector Craddock, voice shaking. "They've just found Mr. Gentry's suitcase forced open in his room. His papers are scattered everywhere. And the landlord says there was a bank book amongst them this morning that isn't there now." Something cold and purposeful settled over the room. The murderer had not finished their work when they struck in the garden. They had gone on tidying the scene afterwards, reaching even into the village itself. It was bold, confident, and very, very dangerous. Miss Marple folded her knitting with an air of quiet finality. Somewhere among these widows, she thought, was not a frightened woman reacting in panic, but someone quite accustomed to planning ahead, to balancing risks against rewards. Someone who had learned long ago that the best way to hide a simple crime was beneath a very complicated story. The discovery of cyanide in Mrs. Marsh's innocent-looking bottle altered the tenor of the room entirely. What had seemed at first a crime of blunt force and panic now took on the deliberate chill of premeditation. Inspector Craddock held the little file as though it might explode, while Mrs. Marsh had collapsed into her chair, her previous theatrics replaced by a slack, shocked silence. "I didn't poison anyone," she whispered hoarsely. "Yes, George used cyanide for his butterflies, but that was years ago. I kept that bottle as—" Her mouth worked soundlessly for a moment. "As a reminder." "People do keep the oddest reminders," Miss Marple said mildly, "though it is unusual to cling to something so very dangerous unless one has some practical intention in mind." She turned her gaze, apparently at random, toward the tea trolley near the sideboard. The cups from earlier still stood there, a faint brown line marking the last of the tea in one of them. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the cups, then flicked to the faces of the 5 widows, one by one. "Tell me, Polly dear," she said gently, "who poured out the tea this afternoon? I seem to recall it wasn't Mrs. Hartwell." Polly, who had remained hovering in the background, jumped slightly at being addressed. It were Mrs. Blackwood, ma'am, like usual when there's company. She says I splash." All eyes turned to Vera Blackwood. Her elegant hands, previously so composed, now tightened upon the back of a chair until the knuckles stood out sharply. "I poured tea, yes," she said, her voice quite even. "One hardly requires treasonous nerve to manage a teapot." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but one does require a certain steadiness and familiarity with precise measurement to handle poisons safely. You worked in a field hospital in Cairo, did you not, Mrs. Blackwood? Dispensing medicines, preparing solutions." A faint flush rose under Mrs. Blackwood's carefully applied powder. "There were many of us in such work." "Indeed, and one might very easily have taken a small professional interest in the various properties of chemicals." Miss Marple's tone remained benign. "I was particularly struck by your calm earlier, when Dr. Haydock mentioned that the tool shed lock had not been forced. You seemed reassured." Inspector Craddock seized on this. "Because you knew whoever killed Gentry must be someone with access. he said sharply. Someone trusted, someone like you. Vera Blackwood laughed, a short, brittle sound. You are chasing ghosts and gossip, Inspector. I poured tea for a charity gathering. If Mr. Gentry was poisoned, it must have been after he left this room. I never even spoke to him. Oh, but you did, Miss Marple murmured. Not with words, perhaps, but with very eloquent actions. She looked toward Mrs. Ward. You said Mr. Gentry had proof of who was taking the money, and why. Did he mention a name? Sylvia hesitated, torn between fear and duty. He didn't write it down, she said slowly. He was too cautious for that, but he hinted. He said the person who'd betrayed the others long ago had reinvented herself as their protector, that she liked to arrange people, like pieces on a chessboard, and that she could not bear to be powerless again. Miss Marple's gentle gaze rested on Vera Blackwood. You were not always a widow dependent on charity, were you, my dear? Before the war, you were Sister Vera Blackwood, entrusted with medical stores. There was an inquiry, I believe, about missing morphia ampules. The matter was hushed up. No one wished a scandal. But the incident would have made you very vulnerable indeed, had anyone wished to exploit it. Mrs. Blackwood's lips parted as though to protest, then closed again. A flicker of naked fury crossed her face before vanishing into composure. Suppose, Miss Marple continued softly, that someone else here, perhaps Mrs. Hartwell, knew about that little episode. Suppose she used it, very gently at first, as a means of ensuring your loyalty. And suppose in time you tired of being the one who was managed, who poured the tea, kept the accounts, did the quiet work in the background. The rain battered against the windows, punctuating each word. Miss Marple's needles lay idle now, forgotten in her lap. In that case, she concluded, when Mr. Gentry began asking questions, you might see in him not a danger, but an opportunity. An opportunity to remove both your blackmailer and your inquisitor, and to place the blame very neatly on another pair of shoulders. Vera Blackwood stood perfectly still, her face expressionless. Yet in the tense silence that followed, Miss Marple caught a telltale sign, a tiny, almost imperceptible gesture. The elegant fingers that had so deftly poured tea flexed once, as though reaching for something that was no longer safely within her control. Inspector Craddock's hand had just brushed the metal of his handcuffs when Miss Marple's soft voice intervened, gentle yet firm enough to halt him mid-motion. If I might suggest, Inspector, that it would be wiser to wait just a moment longer, she said, her needles resting quietly in her lap. There is one small point that troubles me still, and I find such small points are often the most revealing. Mrs. Blackwood's lips curled in a faint, brittle smile. Really, Miss Marple, this is no time for one of your village analogies. Oh, but I think it is, Miss Marple replied mildly. You see, my dear, you nearly convinced me. The poisoned salts, the forged documents, the embezzled money, it all pointed toward you as the very capable mastermind, almost too capable, in fact. Her pale eyes moved thoughtfully to Mrs. Pritchard. You are an excellent copier, Mrs. Pritchard, but not an inventor. The wording of those false wartime letters had a particular tone, a certain official phrasing, very like the circulars once issued by the Ministry of Information. I recall them quite well. Mrs. Marsh, you worked there during the war, did you not? All eyes swung to the fluttering widow, who suddenly seemed less fluttering and more trapped. The nervous handkerchief twisting ceased. Her hands lay very still in her lap. I typed some memoranda, she said faintly. Nothing important, but important enough to remember the exact style and structure, Miss Marple continued. Important enough that when someone needed convincing wartime ghosts, you provided just the right turn of phrase. You see, my dear, forgeries are not only about handwriting, they are about voice. Inspector Craddock's eyes narrowed. Are you suggesting Mrs. Marsh, not Mrs. Blackwood, engineered this? Oh no, Miss Marple said serenely. They engineered it together, but their motives were quite different. Miss Blackwood embezzled to cover debts, yes, but someone else saw in that crime an opportunity. Someone who knew cyanide, who knew bureaucratic tones, and who had a very personal reason to hate the idea of any investigation into the war. Mrs. Marsh made a strangled sound. Miss Marple did not look at her. She continued as though recounting a domestic anecdote. You spoke earlier, Miss Marsh, of having suffered enough and being unable to bear old things being dragged up again. Not fear of exposure for yourself, that would sound rather different. No, yours was the resentment of someone who had already lost something in that war. My brother, Mrs. Marsh whispered, her voice breaking. They shot him for desertion. Miss Marple nodded gently. And Captain Morrison signed the recommendation, did he not? You told yourself for years that if only someone had shared certain information sooner, your brother would never have been at that crossroads. Mr. Gentry's questions must have sounded horribly familiar. Another man prying, another file opened, another judgment. The older woman's hands began to tremble at last. He said he was going to the War Office next. He said there were still records, still things to be found. I thought if I frightened him off, forged enough nonsense, he'd give up. But then he began looking into the money as well. Vera's money. He said one tidy report could ruin us all and make his name. So you adapted, Miss Marple finished quietly. You encouraged Vera's panic, helped her forge a larger drama, and then arranged for Mr. Gentry to take tea in the summer house, with salts you had carefully altered. You knew Vera would be suspected if anything happened. After all, she had stolen, and you wrote the note in Mrs. Hartwell's hand well enough to fool poor Polly. Inspector Craddock stepped toward Mrs. Marsh now. The target of his attention irrevocably shifted. You struck him with the spade? Tears streamed freely down her cheeks. He started choking, clutching his throat. It wasn't supposed to be so fast. He grabbed me, tried to pull himself up. I panicked. The spade was there. I only meant to make it stop. The confession hung in the air, raw and unmistakable. Mrs. Blackwood sagged back into her chair as if an invisible cord had been cut. Mrs. Ward let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep indeed. Later, when the police had gone and Rosemere House lay unnaturally quiet, Miss Marple sat by the window, watching rainwater trace slow paths down the glass. The House of the Five Widows was now, in truth, a house of three, and none of them would ever again believe that the past could be safely buried. Human nature doesn't change, you know, she said softly to Mrs. Clement, who sat beside her. Resentment, fear, the little dishonesties people tell themselves to make life bearable, they are very much like weeds in a garden. Left alone, they have a dreadful way of filling all the empty spaces. She picked up her knitting once more, the needles clicking gently in the hush. And every so often, Miss Marple added, one finds that the prettiest, most delicate-looking flowers have the deepest, most dangerous roots. The room was very still after Mrs. Marsh's broken admission, the only sound the steady patter of rain against the glass and the faint ticking of the mantel clock. The performance was over. What remained was only the tiredness that follows prolonged strain. Inspector Craddock spoke with a quietness that was almost kind. You understand, Mrs. Marsh, that anything you say now will be taken down and may be used in evidence. She gave a small, exhausted nod. I was so tired of being afraid, she whispered. All those years of letters, inquiries, appeals about my brother, always with the same answer, regrettable but necessary. Then Richard Ward with his righteous questions, then this Gentry man with his notebook and his smirk. Always men with files, deciding lives. Her shoulders shook once, convulsively. I only wanted it to stop. Miss Marple regarded her with a grave, almost sorrowful expression. It is so often like that, she said softly. A long-standing hurt festers, and quite a different person ends up paying the price. Craddock signaled to the constable, who stepped quietly forward. Mrs. Hartwell made an involuntary movement, half protest, half instinctive maternal gesture, then stopped, fingers gripping the arm of her chair until the knuckles showed white. Is it strictly necessary to... now? She asked faintly. I'm afraid so, ma'am. Craddock replied, though there was no harshness in his tone. "We must do things properly." As Mrs. Marsh rose, she seemed to fold in upon herself, the fluttering, fussy manner gone, leaving only a small, tired woman whose carefully constructed armor of nerves had finally failed her. When the door closed behind her and the constable, the remaining 4 widows sat in a silence that felt oddly lopsided, as though the room itself had lost its balance. It was Mrs. Ward who spoke first. "I never wanted any of this," she said, voice shaking. "I only wanted to know who was stealing from us, who had dragged Richard's name into it." Mrs. Blackwood answered without looking at her. "I did," she said very low. "There is no use pretending otherwise. I stole the money. I would have paid it back eventually." A mirthless smile touched her lips. "People always say that, don't they?" Craddock's gaze sharpened. "You'll have to make a full statement, Mrs. Blackwood. The Crown may take into account that you did not commit the killing, but your part in the deception will not be ignored." Miss Marple's needles resumed their clicking, a small, homely sound in the strained air. "You see," she said gently, "poor Mrs. Marsh could never have managed it alone. She had the poison, yes, and the old wound. But the rest, the financial juggling, the steady pressure, the idea of gathering all of you under one roof that required a more organized temperament." Vera Blackwood flinched as though struck, but said nothing. "It was you who first suggested Rosemere as a supportive household for widows," Miss Marple continued. "A very practical arrangement, of course, but also one that kept everyone with uncomfortable knowledge nicely under observation. When Mr. Ward began asking questions, you encouraged Dorothy's fears about terrible secrets being unearthed. You knew just which bruise to press." "You make it sound so calculated," Vera murmured. "Because it was," Miss Marple replied, without unkindness. "Though I dare say you did not intend murder. That is the trouble with stirring up old pains. One cannot always control the way they erupt." The clock chimed the hour, a gentle, domestic sound, oddly at variance with the gravity in the room. "I shall need written statements from each of you," said Craddock, rising. "For tonight you will remain at Rosemere. The constable will be posted outside. No more private conferences in summer houses, if you please." His attempt at levity fell flat, but the effort itself eased the tension slightly. As he moved toward the door, he paused beside Miss Marple. "I suppose," he said quietly, "you saw it all long before I did." "Oh no, Inspector," Miss Marple answered, smiling faintly. "I merely watched." "People will tell you everything if you let them, and if you know what small, silly things to notice. Mud on a dry day, clean gardening gloves, and a bottle of salts that no one ever actually used." The days that followed moved with the peculiar slowness that often attends the aftermath of calamity. St. Mary Mead, having feasted heartily on rumor and embellishment, settled by degrees into a more subdued form of gossip, much like a teapot that has finally stopped boiling but remains inexorably warm. The house of the 5 widows, now 4, grew quieter. The curtains at Rosemere seemed to hang heavier. The gravel drive, once busy with visitors and deliveries, lay mostly undisturbed. Yet life, as Miss Marple knew very well, has a tenacious habit of going on. On a mild afternoon a fortnight later, Miss Marple sat once more in Rosemere's drawing-room, her knitting on her lap, though this time the atmosphere was subdued rather than festive. Only 3 of the household's mistresses were present. Mrs. Hartwell sat very straight, the lines around her mouth deeper but her voice firmer, as though final catastrophe had brought, oddly enough, a kind of liberation. Mrs. Pritchard's nervousness had softened into quiet humility, and young Mrs. Ward, no longer the anxious outsider, had taken a seat nearer the hearth, as if claiming a rightful place. "Vera has accepted the board's proposal," Mrs. Hartwell was saying. "She'll sell the small annuity my husband left her and repay what she can. The rest, they say, can be written off as unfortunate mismanagement." Her lips tightened. "Unfortunate indeed." Miss Marple nodded. "Guilt is a heavy thing to drag about, dear. Lighter, perhaps, when shared honestly, instead of hidden under forged papers and secret accounts. Mrs. Pritchard spoke hesitantly. "I shall leave at Michaelmas, Beatrice. My sister in Tunbridge Wells has offered me a room. After everything, I think it best." "Not because you're unwanted," Mrs. Hartwell said quickly, surprising them all, "but because perhaps a smaller household will be kinder for you. Rosemere has too many echoes just now." Miss Marple's eyes rested gently on Sylvia Ward. "And you, my dear, will you stay?" Sylvia met her gaze with a steadiness that had been absent before. "For a time. There's still the matter of Richard's business. Mr. Gentry's papers, those that weren't forged, gave Inspector Craddock quite a clear picture of who benefited from those missing contracts. They'll have to answer for that now." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "It is one of the small consolations of tragedy. Truth, once set in motion, tends to uncover more truth." There was a little silence, filled only by the small ticking of the mantel clock. At length, Mrs. Ward spoke again. "I keep thinking of Mrs. Marsh," she said quietly. "She seemed so silly, so harmless. I feel I should have seen something." "We rarely do," Miss Marple replied. "We look for wickedness in strong lines and loud voices and forget that desperation works most insidiously in the timid." Dorothy Marsh had been rehearsing the role of fragile widow for so long that she almost believed it herself, until something struck too close to the one hurt she could not forgive. Mrs. Pritchard shivered. "Her brother." "Yes, the war took many young men," Miss Marple said. "Some in battle, some by decision of a tribunal. It is not for us to say which wound cut deeper for those left behind." Mrs. Hartwell's voice, when it came, was unexpectedly gentle. "We might have helped her if she'd trusted us." Miss Marple's knitting resumed, the steady click of needles like a quiet punctuation. "You might have," she agreed. "But she did not trust you, Beatrice. You were strong, and strength can be as frightening as cruelty to those who feel themselves weak. She trusted instead in schemes and subterfuge, because those gave her the illusion of control." Outside, the garden glowed with early summer promise. The wisteria over the summer house had been cut back severely. Mrs. Hartwell had ordered it done the day after Dorothy Marsh's arrest. "Too much cover," she had remarked briskly, though Miss Marple suspected there was something more symbolic in the act. As she rose to leave, Miss Marple paused at the French doors, looking toward the now exposed little structure at the end of the path. "I always think," she said reflectively, "that houses remember, in their way. Rosemere has seen much sorrow, but it has also seen courage. Women pooling their lives to survive, even if not always wisely. Perhaps in time, it will be known less as the House of the Five Widows and more simply as a place where people started again." Sylvia followed her to the doorway. "Do you truly believe that, Miss Marple?" "Oh, yes, my dear," Miss Marple replied, eyes kind but shrewd. "Human nature does not change, but circumstances do. You will see to that, I think." And as she walked home along the lane, past the hedges and primroses of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected, as she often did, that murder, in the end, was only an extreme expression of ordinary failings. Fear, greed, wounded pride, unhealed grief. The village would whisper, the seasons would turn, and new lives would sprout among the ruins of the old. She tucked her knitting more firmly under her arm and quickened her step, already wondering what small domestic puzzle might present itself next to exercise her mind before the next great tragedy arrived. For Miss Marple, there was always another pattern to unravel, quietly, unobtrusively, with eyes that missed nothing and a heart that understood far too well what people would do when pressed to the very edge of themselves.